I admit defeat.
The arrogance of Emperor Valens was as much a weapon as his sword, and like a poorly handled blade, it ended up cutting into his own empire. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD is often remembered as the turning point that signaled the slow collapse of Roman dominance. And at the heart of this disaster was one man's ego. Valens, ruling the Eastern Roman Empire, had a chance to crush the Goths with overwhelming force, if only he had waited for his brother, Gratian, to bring reinforcements from the western half of the empire. Instead, driven by pride and a desire to claim sole glory for the victory, Valens made the choice to march his army into a fight they were not prepared for. The outcome would scar Rome for generations. To understand why Valens was so reckless, you need to see the situation from his perspective. The Goths, a massive Germanic tribe, had been allowed into Roman territory under the promise that they would settle peacefully as federates, providing soldiers and stability along the border. But poor management, corruption, and mistreatment by Roman officials pushed the Goths into open rebellion. Suddenly, what had seemed like a manageable arrangement became a full-scale crisis. Cities were plundered, farmlands were torched, and panic spread across the eastern provinces. For an emperor, this was more than just a military issue. It was a question of legitimacy. Valens needed a victory to prove he was still the protector of Rome, and he needed it fast. His brother Gratian was already on his way, with an army that could turn the tide. Gratian had recently scored victories in Gaul and had the momentum to make a difference in the east. Together, their combined forces would have dwarfed the Goths, who, while dangerous, were still less organized and heavily reliant on their cavalry. But Valens was not willing to share the triumph. If Gratian arrived and the two armies marched side by side, the credit for victory would be split. Roman emperors did not like to share credit, especially when their power was fragile. Valens decided he would rather risk everything than let history remember Gratian as the savior of the East. In early August of 378, Valens marched his army toward the Gothic camp near the city of Adrianople in modern-day Turkey. His scouts reported that the Goths numbered around 10,000, figure that suggested the Romans could handle them without too much trouble. What Valens did not know, or did not care to believe, was that the Gothic cavalry, which was crucial to their fighting strength, was away foraging but could return at any moment. In his eagerness to strike before Gratian arrived, Valens misjudged not only the enemy's numbers, but also their readiness. He believed he had the advantage, when in reality, he was about to walk into an ambush. The march itself was grueling. The Roman soldiers, armored and burdened, moved under a scorching sun across rough terrain. By the time they reached the Gothic camp, many were already exhausted, thirsty, and less than battle-ready. Still, Valens pressed them forward. He wanted to crush the Goths quickly and decisively. The Goths, meanwhile, used the terrain and the time to their advantage. They formed a defensive wagon circle, a makeshift fortification that slowed the Roman advance and bought precious minutes until their cavalry returned. And this is where Valens' gamble turned into disaster. Had he waited? Had he scouted properly? Had he allowed Gratian to arrive with reinforcements? The Romans would have had a force that could encircle and overwhelm the Goths. Instead, he had fewer men, tired troops, and no cavalry superiority. When the Gothic horsemen returned and charged into the Roman flanks, the battle was effectively decided. The Roman infantry, no matter how disciplined, was not prepared to withstand a crushing cavalry assault from both sides. For the soldiers caught in the chaos, it was a nightmare. Imagine the heat, the dust, and the deafening clash of metal as the Gothic cavalry slammed into their lines. Shield walls splintered, formations broke apart, and men who had trusted in the strength of Rome suddenly found themselves surrounded. Accounts suggest that entire units were cut down where they stood, with no chance to regroup or retreat. The Roman army, once feared across the known world, was routed in a single afternoon. The numbers tell a grim story. Of the estimated 30,000 Roman soldiers who marched with Valens, 2/3 were killed. The Gothic losses were far lighter, though exact figures remain uncertain. Among the dead was Valens himself. His body was never recovered, though some sources claim he was burned alive in a farmhouse where he had taken refuge. Whether true or not, the mystery of his death became symbolic of the catastrophe a proud emperor consumed by his own arrogance, his remains lost to history. The defeat at Adrianople sent shockwaves through the empire. Never before had the Roman legions been so thoroughly destroyed by a so-called barbarian enemy. The Goths, once seen as a nuisance to be managed, now stood as a legitimate threat capable of shattering Roman power. Worse still, the defeat exposed the empire's vulnerabilities. Poor leadership, reliance on outdated tactics, and an overconfidence that blinded them to reality. Historians often point to Adrianople as the beginning of the end for Rome. While the empire would survive for another century in the east, the psychological blow was enormous. The Romans were supposed to be invincible, the masters of strategy and discipline. Yet at Adrianople, all of that crumbled in the face of a determined enemy and an emperor who thought his pride was more important than patience. Valens' decision is a classic example of how ego can undo even the most powerful states. If he had simply waited a few weeks for Gratian, the outcome might have been entirely different. Instead, he chose to gamble everything on a quick victory that would secure his personal legacy. In doing so, he not only doomed his army, but also set the stage for centuries of decline. And that's what makes the story of Adrianople one of the dumbest mistakes in history. It wasn't a lack of soldiers or weapons or even training that doomed Rome. That diet was arrogance at the very top. Valens' refusal to share glory cost him his life, his army, and the long-term stability of his empire. If you enjoyed this dive into the arrogance and downfall of one of Rome's emperors, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more stories about the blunders, mistakes, and miscalculations that shaped history. This was only the first part of the story. What follows will show just how deeply this disaster cut into the Roman Empire, and why it has been remembered for over 1,600 years. Valens' eagerness to secure a swift victory over the Goths blinded him to the importance of patience and preparation. His decision to rush into battle came after receiving reports that the enemy's numbers were smaller than they actually were. Roman scouts and intelligence officers, perhaps eager to tell the emperor what he wanted to hear, informed him that the Goths were weakened, vulnerable, and lacking reinforcements. In reality, the opposite was true. The Goths were far from beaten. Their numbers were growing by the day, and their cavalry, a highly mobile force, was hidden away. Instead of waiting for his brother Gratian, who was marching eastward with a seasoned army, Valens chose to rely on incomplete intelligence. He believed that by striking first, he could claim all the glory for himself without having to share credit with his co-emperor. This single decision was the spark that would ignite a disaster. To Valens, the chance of being overshadowed by Gratian was unbearable. To the soldiers who followed him, it meant walking into a battle they were not prepared for. The Romans, at this point in history, were still one of the most disciplined and experienced military forces in the world. Their legions had centuries of battlefield tradition behind them, but no amount of training could overcome the simple reality of numbers and mobility. Valens did not know that the Goths, under Fritigern's leadership, had managed to regroup and secure allies. Among their forces was a massive cavalry wing composed of Gothic horsemen and allied riders, whose speed and power would give them a devastating edge against the slower-moving Roman infantry. Think of it this way. Valens believed he was marching to face a scattered warband, easy prey for his disciplined legions. Instead, he was marching toward a trap where his soldiers would find themselves surrounded by enemies who were not only more numerous, but also far more flexible in their tactics. The Goths used the open terrain of the battlefield to their advantage, and Valens had no idea what awaited him. The reports reaching him in the days before Adrianople painted a picture of Gothic weakness. His advisors told him the enemy was running low on supplies, that their morale was shaky, and that their warriors were exhausted after months of skirmishing. To a proud Roman emperor, these were tempting words. Victory seemed close, and if he struck fast, he could destroy the Goths before Gratian even arrived. Every day he waited risked giving his brother the chance to arrive and steal the spotlight. The decision to march forward was not just a military one, it was political, personal, and rooted in Valens' desire for recognition. Roman emperors often had to balance their public image with their military duties. Victories on the battlefield were not just about protecting borders, they were about proving strength and legitimacy. Valens feared that if he delayed, he would look weak, a leader who hesitated when bold action was needed. That fear outweighed the warnings from cautious generals in his ranks who urged patience. As his army moved toward Adrianople, the signs of danger were there. Scouts reported movements of Gothic horsemen on the horizon, but these were dismissed as small raiding parties. Dust clouds in the distance hinted at larger forces, yet Valens convinced himself that they were stragglers, not organized troops. He was so eager to believe the flattering reports of a weakened enemy that he ignored evidence to the contrary. The Romans advanced under a scorching summer sun. Soldiers wore heavy armor, carried shields, and marched for miles in oppressive heat. By the time they neared the Gothic position, many were already fatigued. Valens did not allow them the time to properly rest, regroup, or even form supply lines. Instead, he pushed them forward, determined to engage the Goths immediately. His gamble was that the enemy would scatter before the discipline of his legions. But what he didn't know was that Fritigorn was deliberately stalling for time, waiting for his cavalry to return to the battlefield. This was the fatal flaw in Valens' rush to battle. He believed he was seizing the initiative, but in truth, he was playing directly into his enemy's hands. By attacking without Gratian, he gave up the numbers and reinforcements that could have evened the odds. By ignoring reports of Gothic cavalry, he underestimated the single most dangerous element of their force. And by pushing his soldiers into combat without proper rest or preparation, he weakened their ability to fight effectively in the battle to come. The situation was eerily similar to other blunders in military history, where leaders acted on flawed intelligence and paid the price. For example, centuries later, Napoleon would invade Russia under the impression that his armies could quickly overwhelm a weakened foe. Instead, he walked into a trap of logistics, weather, and an enemy more resilient than he had imagined. Valens' error at Adrianople carries the same weight. Arrogance combined with bad information is a deadly mix. The tragedy of it all is that Valens had alternatives. He could have waited a few weeks for Gratian's forces to arrive, doubling his strength and ensuring overwhelming superiority. He could have taken time to scout the terrain more carefully, to test the enemy with small probes instead of committing his entire army. But in his mind, these were not options. Waiting meant sharing the victory, and Valens wanted the honor all to himself. The result was that he led tens of thousands of men into a battle they could not win. The march to Adrianople was not just the movement of an army, it was the march of pride, misinformation, and ambition colliding with reality. The Roman soldiers who followed their emperor that day trusted his judgment. They believed in the centuries-old tradition of Roman dominance, yet what they did not know was that their leader had already sealed their fate by choosing speed over caution, ego over strategy, and flawed reports over hard truth. And so, the stage was set. The Romans approached the Gothic camp, unaware that they were stepping into a carefully laid trap. Fritigern's warriors waited, their cavalry positioned to strike at the perfect moment. Valens, blinded by ambition and driven by impatience, prepared to lead his men into one of the darkest days the Roman military would ever face. The day of the battle was blistering. The Roman soldiers had already marched for hours under the weight of their armor, shields, and weapons. The heat drained them before they even reached the enemy. Many were thirsty, some were fatigued, yet Valens pressed them forward. He believed that victory was close at hand, that the Goths would crumble once they saw the discipline of a Roman battle line advancing toward them. What he didn't realize was that Fritigorn, the Gothic leader, had no intention of giving him a straightforward fight. Fritigorn played for time. He knew the Romans were tired and impatient. As the legions arrived near the Gothic position, they saw the enemy camp fortified with wagons and defended by warriors who seemed willing to parley. Messengers went back and forth as Fritigorn pretended to negotiate, offering peace talks, promising to submit, all while secretly waiting for the rest of his army. His cavalry was still away, foraging and gathering strength. The longer he delayed, the weaker the Romans became, standing in the open under the burning sun with no shade, no water, and no clear orders. Valens, restless and unwilling to wait, finally ordered his men forward. He wanted to strike before Gratian could appear on the horizon. But in his haste, he walked straight into the trap. When the Romans advanced on the Gothic wagon circle, they expected to break through quickly. The first clashes were fierce, but the Goths fought hard from behind their defenses. Roman discipline held at first, but their formations were stretched thin, and they were not prepared for what was about to happen next. From beyond the hills and ridges came the thunder of hooves, the sound of thousands of Gothic cavalry charging toward the battlefield. The Roman scouts had underestimated their numbers, And now the truth came crashing down, literally. The cavalry, both Gothic and allied horsemen, swept down onto the Roman flanks. Their speed and force were overwhelming. The Roman infantry, tightly packed and already weary, could not maneuver quickly enough to respond. Shields locked, spears braced, the legions tried to hold their ground, but the horsemen crashed into their sides and rear, smashing through their lines like a hammer against brittle glass. Chaos spread through the Roman ranks. Commanders shouted orders that could not be heard over the roar of the battle. Dust choked the air, blood stained the dry earth, and the disciplined legions that had once conquered the known world were now trapped in a nightmare. Surrounded on all sides, the Romans were pressed tighter and tighter together, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to fight effectively. The very discipline that had once been their strength now became a weakness. As men crammed into close ranks were cut down where they stood, the Gothic cavalry circled the Romans like wolves around trapped prey. Each charge broke another section of the Roman line. Soldiers who tried to flee were hunted down and slaughtered. Units dissolved into panicked mobs, with men throwing down their shields in desperation. The Roman commanders could do nothing to restore order. Valens himself, somewhere in the chaos, realized the disaster that had unfolded, but it was far too late to change course. Eyewitness accounts later described the scene as a slaughter. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers fell that day, their bodies left scattered across the battlefield. It was not just a defeat, it was an annihilation. Entire units of experienced legionaries, men who had spent their lives in the service of Rome, were wiped out in a matter of hours. What had begun as a confident advance turned into one of the darkest days in Roman military history. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical one. The Roman legions were used to victory. For centuries, they had crushed enemies from Britain to the Middle East, defeating countless tribes and kingdoms. Their confidence was built on the belief that Roman discipline and training could overcome any opponent. But at Adrianople, that belief was shattered. The legions discovered that they were not invincible. Against an enemy that combined mobility, numbers, and clever tactics, their rigid formations collapsed. To understand the scale of the disaster, imagine an army that expected to intimidate and overawe its enemy, suddenly realizing that it was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and surrounded. The Goths had prepared for this moment, and Valens had delivered his soldiers straight into their hands. Roman discipline could not hold against cavalry swarming from every direction. The result was a massacre, not a battle. As the sun set, the battlefield was a scene of carnage. Roman bodies lay in heaps, their armor glinting in the fading light. Horses trampled the dead and dying as Gothic warriors stripped weapons and armor from the fallen. Those who tried to escape were pursued far from the field and cut down. It was said that the Romans lost 2/3 of their army, that an almost unimaginable number for an empire that depended on its legions to maintain control across its vast territories. For Valens, the cost was personal. His pride and impatience had led him to ignore warnings, underestimate his enemy, and commit his men to battle under the worst possible conditions. Surrounded and facing certain death, the emperor himself disappeared in the chaos. Some sources claim he was cut down by enemy warriors. Others say he was taken to a nearby farmhouse, where Gothic soldiers set it on fire, burning him alive. Whatever the truth, his body was never recovered, a grim symbol of the disaster that had consumed his army. The crushing defeat at Adrianople stunned the Roman world. News of the massacre spread quickly, shaking the confidence of an empire that had long believed in its military supremacy. The death of Valens and the destruction of his army left the Eastern Roman Empire exposed and vulnerable. But for the soldiers on the ground, the disaster was more immediate. They had marched out under the blazing sun believing they would win glory. Instead, they marched into death, victims of their emperor's ambition and their enemies' cunning. The Romans had faced defeats before, but Adrianople was different. It was not just the loss of an army, it was the loss of faith in the very system that had sustained Rome for centuries. The crushing power of the Gothic cavalry, the sheer scale of the slaughter, and the humiliating death of an emperor combined to make this battle one of the most shocking in Rome's long history of war. In the chaos of Adrianople, one figure stood out above all others, the emperor himself. Valens, who had led his army into battle with dreams of glory, now found himself in the middle of a nightmare. His decision to fight without his brother's reinforcements had been born of arrogance and impatience. Now surrounded by the dust, the screams, and the relentless thunder of Gothic cavalry, he faced the full weight of that choice. The Roman army was collapsing around him. Entire units had been crushed, and men who once prided themselves on discipline and order were running in every direction, trying to escape. Standard-bearers threw down their banners to avoid drawing enemy attention, while commanders lost all control of their men. What had started as a confident advance had turned into an unrecognizable mass of panicked soldiers tripping over each other in desperation. For the emperor, there was no longer an army to command, only fragments of survivors scattered across the battlefield. Valens was not the kind of emperor who had spent his career on campaign. He was not a hardened general like some of his predecessors. His experience was limited, and in this moment of crisis, it showed. He tried to rally his guards, but their shouts were drowned by the chaos. Arrows fell, horsemen charged, and the once-proud legions of Rome collapsed into dust. Somewhere in the confusion, the emperor's protective circle began to shrink. His guards cut down one by one. The exact details of Valens' death are uncertain, and that mystery has fueled debate for centuries. Some ancient writers claimed he fell in the thick of combat, cut down by Gothic swords as his men were slaughtered around him. Others told a darker story that he was carried, wounded, into a farmhouse by his last loyal guards. The Goths, discovering his hiding place, set the building ablaze, trapping the emperor inside and leaving him to burn alive. Regardless of which account is true, one thing is certain: Valens never escaped the battlefield. His body was never recovered, and the emperor of Rome vanished into the chaos. His end, as humiliating as the defeat itself, the death of an emperor on the battlefield was more than a personal tragedy. It was a disaster for the Roman state. In Rome's long history, emperors had died by assassination, conspiracy, and civil war. But to be slain in open battle by foreign tribes was something altogether different. It was a wound to Roman pride, a public demonstration that the empire's power could be shattered not by internal treachery, but by enemies from beyond its borders. The political shockwave was immediate. News spread through the empire that Valens had perished with his army. The Eastern Roman Empire was suddenly leaderless, its military gutted, its frontiers exposed. In an age where emperors were seen as the embodiment of Roman strength and divine favor, losing one so disastrously broke the illusion of invincibility. If the emperor himself could fall in battle, what protection was left for the provinces and cities that depended on him? Valens' death also revealed the deep cracks in Roman leadership. His refusal to wait for Gratian's reinforcements had not just been a tactical mistake, it was a fatal flaw rooted in rivalry and pride. Gratian, still marching east, was left to inherit the wreckage of his brother's decision. Instead of joining forces in victory, he arrived too late to do anything but mourn the destruction of an entire Roman field army and the loss of his co-emperor. The Goths, for their part, understood the magnitude of what they had achieved. Killing an emperor and destroying his army was not just a battlefield victory, it was a message to the world that Rome could be beaten. Their triumph at Adrianople emboldened them and other tribes who watched from afar. What had once seemed impossible, the defeat of Rome's mighty legions, was now a reality. Future invaders would look back on Adrianople as proof that the empire was vulnerable, that even the greatest military machine of the ancient world could bleed. On the ground, the defeat was total. Survivors who managed to flee the battlefield carried with them stories of horror and shame. Some hid in forests and hills, wandering for days before finding their way back to Roman territory. Others were captured and enslaved, forced to serve the very tribes they had once despised. The battlefield itself became a graveyard, littered with Roman bodies and abandoned equipment. For months, scavengers picked through the remains, stripping armor, weapons, and valuables from the dead. The loss of Valens also raised troubling questions about the empire's future. If an emperor could die in battle against the Goths, what would stop them or others from marching deeper into Roman lands? The frontier was no longer a secure barrier, but an open door, one that could be tested again and again. The empire, already strained by internal divisions and economic troubles, had now suffered a humiliation that could not be ignored or easily repaired. The Battle of Adrianople did not just end an emperor's life, it ended an era. Valens' death symbolized the collapse of an old belief that Roman armies, led by Roman emperors, could always crush the so-called barbarians. The truth was far harsher. The legions were no longer the unstoppable force they once were, and Rome itself was not immune to defeat. For the men who had followed Valens into battle, the emperor's final stand was less an act of courage and more a grim reminder of misplaced faith. They had trusted him to lead them to victory. Instead, his pride and rashness had led them into disaster. His fall was not the death of just one man, but of thousands, and the shadow it cast over Rome would linger long after the smoke cleared. In the end, Valens' body was never found, but his legacy was written in the ashes of Adrianople. His gamble for glory had turned into ruin, and his death became a warning carved into the memory of the empire. It was proof that Rome's enemies could win, that emperors could fall, and that the foundations of the empire itself were far less secure than anyone had dared to believe. The Battle of Adrianople did not just cost the Roman Empire an emperor and an army. It struck at the very heart of Roman confidence, shaking the empire to its core and marking a turning point in its long history. Ancient writers themselves recognized the magnitude of the disaster. Ammianus, Marcellinus, a soldier and historian, compared it to the catastrophic defeat at Cannae, where Hannibal crushed the Roman legions centuries earlier. But Adrianople was different. Cannae had been followed by Rome's resurgence and eventual triumph. Adrianople, by contrast, opened the gates to a decline that could never be reversed. The loss of manpower was devastating. The Roman legions at Adrianople represented one of the empire's last great standing armies in the east, tens of thousands of trained soldiersmen who had taken years to prepare for. Battle were wiped out in a single day. It was not just a tactical loss, it was a hemorrhage of the empire's military strength. Unlike in earlier centuries, Rome could no longer simply recruit fresh legions from an endless pool of citizens. By the late 4th century, the empire was already stretched thin, its population declining, its treasury strained. Replacing those men would take time that Rome did not have. The psychological blow was just as severe. Rome had always cultivated an image of invincibility, of legions that could not be beaten by barbarian tribes. Adrianople shattered that illusion. The Goths had not only stood their ground against Roman steel and discipline, they had crushed it. They had encircled and destroyed a Roman army in open battle, something that generations of Romans would have considered impossible. Word of the defeat spread quickly, and with it came fear. If the Goths could do this, what would stop other tribes from trying the same? In fact, that is exactly what happened. Adrianople emboldened not just the Goths, but a host of other groups living on Rome's frontiers. Vandals, Huns, Alans, and countless others saw that the empire could be defeated, and they pressed harder into its lands. Adrianople was not the sack of Rome in 410, nor was it the final collapse in 476, but it was the beginning of a chain of events that made those later disasters possible. It stripped away the aura of Roman supremacy and replaced it with vulnerability. The battle also revealed a deeper problem: Rome's dependence on foreign auxiliaries. For decades, the empire had been recruiting and even resettling barbarian tribes inside its borders, using them as soldiers and workers. But the relationship was fragile. The Goths themselves had been allowed into the empire under Valens' watch. Fleeing from the Huns, corruption, exploitation, and neglect had turned them from potential allies into enemies. Adrianople was, in many ways, the result of Rome's inability to manage its own frontier policy. The empire had taken in a desperate people but failed to treat them with fairness or foresight. And in return, those same people dealt it one of its greatest defeats. The death of Valens also created political instability. The Eastern Empire suddenly had no emperor, and Gratian, ruling in the West, was forced to stretch his resources to cover both halves of the empire. This division of responsibility was already straining the Roman system, but Adrianople made the cracks impossible to ignore. The loss of unity and trust between the East and West would continue to haunt the empire for the next century, until the western half finally collapsed under the weight of repeated invasions. What makes Adrianople even more significant is how clearly it exposed Rome's failure to adapt. The empire had once thrived on innovation, from the discipline of its legions to its mastery of engineering and logistics. But by the late 4th century, Rome's military had grown rigid and complacent. The Goths fought with mobility, with cavalry that could outmaneuver heavy infantry, and with a resilience born of desperation. The Romans, still relying on the tactics that had worked in earlier centuries, found themselves outmatched. the defeat was not just about numbers, it was about a system that could no longer keep up with the changing face of warfare. For the Romans who survived, Adrianople was a scar that never healed. The battlefield itself became a symbol of loss, a place where an emperor and an army had vanished in a storm of dust, fire, and blood. Survivors carried stories of horror back to the cities, tales of comrades cut down, of cavalry sweeping through the ranks like a tide, of the emperor himself disappearing into the flames of a burning farmhouse. These stories spread, planting seeds of doubt in a society that had long believed in the eternal strength of Rome. Future generations would look back on Adrianople as more than just another battle. It was a warning sign, a moment when the balance of power began to shift. Rome was no longer the unstoppable force of old. It was an empire on the defensive, an empire bleeding from wounds that would only deepen in the coming century. Adrianople was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end, the day the Roman Empire began its long, slow fall from greatness. And so, the arrogance of one emperor, the desperation of a neglected people, and the clash of outdated tactics against new realities combined to create one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. The shadow of Adrianople would stretch for generations, haunting Rome until the empire itself finally crumbled under the weight of its own mistakes. If you've enjoyed this story of pride, strategy, and downfall, make sure to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more tales of history's greatest blunders. This was part 5 of 5, and the end of our look at Emperor Valens and the disaster at Adrianople.